Okay. Hello. Sorry for the confusion here. We're trying to solve our problems with voice and video sync. And last week we had some real problems, so we went over to Zoom. And when we did that, we lost everyone because I put the wrong URL into the into the system. And so nobody could find us, I thought. So I did record it last week on Zoom, and let me just get my thingy here. So I did record it last week on Zoom, and I've been posting the video from that session, and so tonight I'm just going to go ahead and come back to YouTube because we tried to do it on Zoom tonight and nobody came. So apparently people do not want to appear on video conference, and so I understand people's reticence considering it's crazy times. So I'll take all the responsibility for being on camera, and let me see where I was on this. Okay, 72. Okay. All right. So before I begin with, I don't need my headset anymore, so I'm going to take it off and just watch your chats on YouTube. So, before I start with The Secret of the Golden Flower tonight, I wanted to read a couple of things. This morning I had an email from one of our subscribers, and I thought it raised an interesting question, and so I proceeded to answer the question. And so I thought I would read to you both the question and the answer this evening. And so I'm going to do that now. So the question is, Dear Mr. Conover, I first want to thank you for bringing the works of Carl Jung into an understandable framework for today's public. I am a young physics student, and I am looking forward to read Jung's original works. Until now, I have only read about psychology and religion and got a gist of man and his symbols. I have come to this topic through Dr. Jordan Peterson and Mr. Vanderklay on YouTube. I have read Peterson, religious scholars such as Eliade, and I am beginning with Campbell. I am beginning to read Campbell. My question is, though, although I find all these works very interesting, and I am learning a lot about the concepts behind ancient philosophy and mysticism, these topics seem to have lost the war of ideas in the spirit of the time. Logical empiricism and positivism have taken over in order to set the foundations of a scientific worldview. Metaphysics has lost its recognition, and most competitors to naturalism and scientific realism are only topics for the philosophy historians. To get to my question, what fundamental framework, be it ontological or phenomenological, can give a logically consistent or perhaps pragmatic worldview that provides a basis so that works by people such as Jung can be seen as serious claims about the objective world? Because so far, scientific positivism deems Jung's work to be an occult pseudoscience. And again, thanks for your work. Cheers. Okay, so that's a good question, isn't it? Why are we here? Fundamental question. And I guess if I can't explain that, then there's no reason to follow me. But in any case, let me see if I can give you the answer. And I want to just see. I think I have my answer here. I do, yes, okay. Which will allow me to give you some links at the appropriate time. So, dear subscriber, point 1, Dr. Jung was not a proponent of philosophy or mysticism. He was a scientist who was into explaining psychologically how they work as tools to manipulate people and populations, not in a woo-wee-woo sort of way. I can probably give you a tarot reading, for example, that will knock your socks off, but I will never claim that it is because of occult powers. Very simply, it is because the tarot rely on archetypes that are in everyone, and it really doesn't matter what I say. Some of the things will hit some sore spot or other in your psyche, and you will think I have special powers. I don't. I just know how the mind works, and that the cards are varied enough to find something in everyone. Dr. Jung's critics have used some of his researches into these topics as a way of trying to hold back his ideas, but they were wrong, and they are in the process of failing in their endeavor, as the growth of my YouTube channel, among many others, demonstrates. And oh, by the way, speaking of science and psychology, I received a copy of the Scientific Tarot a few weeks ago, and I did a tarot reading yesterday for the giver. She was quite satisfied with the reading, and I did one for my wife too, and she liked the reading. And after I did it, she had a spurt of creativity. My wife did, and is off to writing a novel. In any case, let me carry on with this letter. Dear Dr. Edward Edinger gave an interview and 2 lectures which will put you immediately and profoundly into the midst of Jungian thought. I've transcribed all 3. The links to my transcriptions and the audio are here, only the interview is video. Okay, so first of all is Edward Edinger's summation of Jungian psychology, and I'm going to give you the link for that right now. So if you haven't seen these things, I urge you to take a look at each of these. So that's one. And I don't know what wait a minute, that's not what I meant to give you. So somehow my copy process decided to make a mistake. Here's the correct link. Yep. Okay, so that's it. Oh, I see. It's a little bit too big for the 200 words, so I'm going to have to play with it a little bit. There it is. Okay, so that's the first one. Then the second one is Encounters with the Greater Personality, and if you have been around me for a while, you know that I like to refer people to these transcripts and to the audio or visual as they are. So that's the Encounter with the Greater Personality. Whoops, I have another problem on the size of this, so I'm just going to change it back to Encounters. You'll see the full title on, well, it doesn't like that, so let me take all of that off. Okay, I got it back to being sendable. All right, so this is the second link. That's to Encounters with the Greater Personality. Then the third one is the individuation one, and that is linked here. So all of those three talks by Edward Edinger really put you right soundly in the middle of Jungian psychology. And if you haven't read through them, I highlighted them. I took the liberty when I was transcribing them to highlight them for your benefit. And so you can look through them fairly quickly. They're each about either an hour or an hour and a half long, but they're very good ones. Okay, so then I go on in my response to the student. I highly recommend you read Answer to Job at your earliest convenience. I have read it into YouTube, so you don't need to buy the book, but you will need to get it all. And again, here's the link to the YouTube playlist for which I now have official permissions from the publisher. And so the first video here is a reading toward the end of the book when I had a numinous and synchronous experience on video. You need to listen carefully to the very first sentence, then watch the event from 2 minutes and 9 seconds of the video, then the discussion after at 4 minutes 55 seconds and 6 minutes 45 seconds. The event won't affect you the way it did me, but is provided as an example of a religious experience. So that's that. Dr. Jung avoided metaphysics, Dr. Jung avoided metaphysics, at least according to him. He spoke only of the God image, which is the deepest archetype in the unconscious, and which he could demonstrate empirically. Sadly, theologians and psychologists ignored him because what he found is badly needed. The because relates back to the sadly. Sadly, because what he found is badly needed. Listen to Dr. Edinger on that. Okay, so going on. The fundamental issue your question addresses is the question of logos and eros. Logos has taken us very far, but it is sterile. A Bible is just a thick book with a bunch of ancient stories, unless you put life in it. Read eros. A scientific theory is just a concept unless you put life into it. As Dr. Jung points out in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job, it was neither the uranium nor the laboratory equipment which built the atomic bomb. That had to be done by living scientists who were using their eros to give what they knew conceptually logos, meaning. To give what they knew conceptually, logos, meaning. Nothing has meaning without eros. It's just a thing. You must have heard the news this week that one neutrino was discovered at the Ice Cube station in Antarctica, which has been traced to an ancient galaxy, and yet the project to catch a neutrino that could be traced has consumed billions of dollars in multiple projects across the world. Where did those billions of dollars come from? From eros. If it had just been a matter of a logos-style concept, it would still be sitting in a few megabits of some physicist's hard drive. This can be considered the origin of the phrase, get a life. Books, textbooks, and university classes are a lot of logos, but they mean nothing until you do something with them. Are you married? You can read 1,000 books about the ins and outs of marriage, but there is nothing that will prepare you for what it actually takes to share your life with a life partner. For that, you need the experience, which means eros. You are right that theologians and psychologists have been writing Dr. Jung's oeuvre out of the picture for a century. They were wrong. Nietzsche opined that God is dead. Dr. Jung's rejoinder was to show that God lives, where he lives, and how he goes about the business of the Godhead. We can have a one-on-one discussion on this topic at your convenience on Zoom. Just let me know when, and I'm willing to do that with anyone. So if you want to have a Zoom conference with me to clarify some point, just send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. I'll put my email address here for your convenience. Okay. So, what is the fundamental framework to cover Dr. Jung? There is none. You can get all the framework from the logical rationalism of Dr. Peterson, any number of theologians, etc. Paul Vanderklay will be only too happy to beat you over the head with rational arguments going back 2,000 years. What he is doing is hypnotizing you, which is what theologians have relied upon for all of those years. Just go to a divinity school and learn a pile of logical arguments, and then you can convince anyone of anything. Remember, Galileo was convicted by the Inquisition and had to swear on a Bible that the earth is the center of the universe. He knew the Catholic Church kept good notes, so he made monkeys of them for all time. In the following essay, I was actually wrong. These astronomers didn't miss one universe. They missed 7.5 billion of them. The name of the essay is Carl Sagan and Neil deGrasse Tyson Missed an Entire Universe. Okay, I'll give you the link to that. This is my essay written a couple years back, but it's still quite relevant, and I'll be happy to debate Neil deGrasse Tyson at any point. The funny thing is he gets into the same metaphysics that anybody else gets into when he starts talking about dark matter and dark energy. So going on with my response, though. So if you're looking for a rational explanation of Dr. Jung, you're looking in the wrong place, because Dr. Jung was working with the irrational part of life, which we desperately need to understand. It explains exactly how Donald Trump got elected, for example, which is precisely why all of our talking heads on cable news are still scratching their heads. There are a couple of key quotes from Answer to Job. In paragraph 751, quote, "What most people overlook or seem unable to understand is the fact that I regard the psyche as real. They believe only in physical facts and must consequently come to the conclusion that either the uranium itself or the laboratory equipment created the atom bomb. That is no less absurd than the assumption that a non-real psyche is responsible for it. God is an obvious psychic and non-physical fact, i.e., a fact that can be established psychically, but not physically." Now, in this regard, take a look around your room, and everything that you can see in your room, with the exception of potted plants, is a product of the human psyche, even you, because you were once a twinkle in your father's eye. And so the point is that we can do nothing without the psyche, and yet theologians and a lot of psychologists try to write the psyche out of the system. And one of the big reasons we have an opioid epidemic is because people keep going to Freudians and other psychologists for drugs for their depression rather than resolving their mental hygiene issues at a depth level. So you can, using a drug to solve your mental hygiene needs is like putting a Band-Aid on a cut. It's not going to do you much good, though, if you just had a major surgery or something like that. Okay, so going on with the quote, paragraph 752. "But religious statements, without exception, have to do with the reality of the psyche and not with the reality of the faces." So in other words, every religious statement that relates to the physical world has nothing to do with the reality of religion. That's basically what he's saying. And in the same paragraph, but a bit earlier, quote, "It does not matter at all that a physically impossible fact is asserted, because all religious assertions are physical impossibilities. If they were not so, they would, as I said earlier, necessarily be treated in the textbooks of natural science. So there is almost no inquiry on the planet that is more important than yours, because human beings have been killing one another and destroying millions of lives for the wrong reasons for thousands of years. Very simply, we don't understand ourselves. The theologians have dissed Dr. Jung's work because they want to protect their rice bowl of being the intermediary to God. All religions have served for mental hygiene for human beings for thousands of years, but now the scientific method has punched holes in their stories. The point is, however, that if they just paid attention to what Dr. Jung was saying, they could use his insights to maintain full employment for the right reasons, which are undeniable to any thinking individual. Let me refer you back to the first Edinger interview above for further reference on this. Let me refer you back to the first Edinger interview above for further reference on this. The scientific method wants to solve for X by holding many factors constant. That can get you just so far before you have anomalies. I used to work with a man who had been the national collegiate champion in speed chess in the U.S.A. His intellect lit up the room when he walked in. But he was a failed businessman who ended up as a fugitive from justice. Why? Because while there are 2.5 billion or so moves in a chess game, which he could easily grok, human beings tend to wiggle just a little bit more than chess pieces. and they have more than 64 squares for their fields of dreams. Dr. Jung's oeuvre is about understanding ourselves, nothing more or less. He operated in a much more complex environment than your average physicist because he got a new universe walking in the door with every patient. Now let me explain my metaphysics comment above, where I said Dr. Jung avoided metaphysics. Actually, he said that he wasn't talking about the metaphysical God, but from where I sit, all psychology is metaphysics, because it certainly is not physics. There's no one running around with the scientific method that has understood psychology. No, even Jungian psychologists and the Jungian institutes have hidden what Dr. Jung was saying about religion for a century, their rationale being that they had to protect their fledgling profession from attacks by theologians. But it is now intensely important that we understand what Dr. Jung was saying about us as beings, or there is a very good chance that we will destroy all of us. Now there's some good news, and I'm going to give you a link to another video which I just watched this morning. It was given to me by one of our subscribers, and it's very good news in terms of our proclivity for destroying ourselves. And so I thought I would only dabble into it a little bit this morning, but I ended up getting started with it and not being able to stop. And it does have good news, so I hope you'll take a look at that. The name of the video is Chaos, Violence, War, and Barbarism, Why Humanity and Peace Will Prevail. Okay, and if you've been watching the news today, it would also give you reason to understand why common sense will prevail in the end. Okay, so subscriber, I regard the fact that you asked your question a good sign that some in your generation understand that something is seriously amiss. The question is, what will you do about it? Dr. Jung's answer was to awaken consciousness about these issues. Another question is, what will Paul Vanderklay do about it? He is still hypnotized by the beginning of the Christian era, when parts of humanity started to climb up out of barbarity. But we are now entering into a new era, and we need to know where the Spirit, the Holy Ghost, if you will, is taking us as a species. Dr. Edinger delineated 3 eras. Number 1, the era of the law, i.e. the 10 Commandments, cause and effect, karma, what goes around comes around, which is, karma is what goes around, comes around in Buddhism. But anyway, the era of the law, and that was developed by early Jews, beginning with Moses, and they established the law which allowed the development of their culture. And since we don't have great records in the Western world about other cultures, even though there were 100 million human beings in the world at 500 BC, that was the era of the law. Then along came Christ, and so the second era is the era of belief, which sold us the all-good God, privatio boni, but individuation, that is, awareness of the opposites, and World Wars I and II have proven the inadequacy of that. Okay, depending on what side you were on and who you were related to, you might not think God was all good after that war. And certainly, as I lost my roommate in Vietnam, I don't see that God was all good in that case either. Okay, so the third era is the era of psychology. That is, waking up to understand ourselves and others as human beings from a psychological point of view so that we can rise above the fray. This is not metaphysics, but it is also not physics. It is something new, and it will be up to your generation to understand and implement the new way of thinking. I can only point the way. And then I explained to him, I will be using your question without mentioning your name in my weekly reading group tonight, which will put it into the video by itself within the week. It's a good question, and I've done my best to answer it, but Dr. Jung wrote 20 volumes of collected works and many more volumes of letters, so you have to consider this just a précis off the top of my head. So, okay, so that was the exchange from this morning, and I'll now look at any questions you may have. Let's see where we are. Yes, we have an audience. We have 10 live participants right now, and normally when I am showing 10, it means that during the course of the proceedings we may get between 30 and 50 at some point in the conversation. So I'm not sure what your point is, Grenade, about I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Obviously, that's what Oppenheimer said at the explosion of nuclear weapon, but I'm not quite sure of its relevance here. Thomas Dennis says, Jung books to explore. I enjoyed Dr. Jung's seminar transcript, The Psychology of Kundalini Yoga. It's very readable with questions from seminar attendees. That happens to be one I've not read, Thomas, but I intend to at some point. I'm working as fast as I can, but can't do everything. And then Grenade says, you should listen to Sean Carroll. He talks about space not being a fundamental property of reality. Okay, he's a physicist at Caltech, quantum physics. I was actually wondering today whether space, which we used to refer to as a, quote, vacuum, actually has any atoms in it other than the atoms that are in the gas and the dust, which we can see. So I don't know whether there's anything in space or not, other than what is an atom that's being drawn somewhere. I can't say. Maybe a physicist can tell us. So Grenade says, been there, been through the whole Alcoholics Anonymous gambit, haha. You are right, addiction is an epidemic, especially among young people today, myself included. Well, and obviously the great debate that involves Jordan Peterson, Paul Vanderklay, Sam Harris, and a couple of others is raging out there, and a lot of people haven't come to grips with it yet. And a lot of people want to understand religion, and I'm not sure that Paul is really helping them. I mean, he's giving them the school solution. He's giving them, from what I've seen, and I've not seen every one of his videos because he's extremely prolific also, and I'm preparing a lot of videos. But what I've seen of Paul's videos, he tends to fall back on the listing of all these sources and authorities going back 2,000 years, and that's all well and good, and that's all logos, but that's not an experience of God. And the way I originally approached him was, does he have a way that he helps his congregants actually experience God? And in this discussion, I've given you a link to one of my religious experiences. There are several on the YouTube channel that I happen to have caught on either video or still camera. And so those relate to me. They won't necessarily affect you in the same way. I can tell you my story about what happened to me when I had those religious experiences. But what I can tell you is that after having those experiences, and many more over my lifetime, those aren't the only ones, but those are the ones I've caught on video in the last 2 years, when I happen to be talking on a video conference like this, or recording what I was saying to our group. Those are the ones that I happen to catch on video, and they're hard to catch on video, as you might guess. And so anyway, okay. So moving along, I'd like to finish off our friend, The Secret of the Golden Flower tonight. And so last week I was beginning with part 6 of The Secret of the Golden Flower. Now, for those of you who may be new to this series, The Secret of the Golden Flower is contained in Alchemical Studies by C.G. Jung, and it's volume 13 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. It's the first essay in that book, and I decided to do a now 7-week detailed discussion of it because in many ways it underpins everything that Dr. Jung later wrote. And so when he was writing it in 1928-29, he was actually laying out the agenda for his future life and much of his writing over the next 30 years. So it's a good base for all of Jungian psychology. And obviously you can catch other installments of this series on the YouTube channel. This, I think, is the 7th week, but it might be the 8th. Thomas Dennis says, Thomas More's works, Care of the Soul, for instance, works more for me than Peterson, Harris, and the others. Well, I guess that makes sense to me, Thomas, since you're here on a Jungian channel, and Thomas More was a Jungian analyst, or is a Jungian analyst. He's done a lot of very valuable writing, and he's one of my favorite authors as well. And he does write in a rather understandable. He writes in a rather understandable way, and but he doesn't give away his knowledge the way I do. So I'm not pretending to put together a book here. I'm just pretending to have an experience with reading Dr. Jung and feeling personal gratitude, actually, for my own mental hygiene, which has been possible thanks to the work of Dr. Jung. And so the genesis of this reading group 2 years ago was that I wanted to share my interpretation of what Dr. Jung had to say with others, and then it's for you to decide whether it's useful to you or not. Dan says, empty space is not empty. Empty space is a bubbling soup of quantum field fluctuations. Okay, so by that, Dan, you mean that there are atoms in empty space, I gather. So Thomas's experiential is good. So here we're going to go on with experiential. All right, so at the beginning of this part 6 of The Secret of the Golden Flower, paragraph 72, I spoke about this last week, but some of you didn't get to see that yet because we were having problems with the YouTube channel last week, and we moved over to Zoom. I have that video, and I've put a couple of them up, but I don't think I got to this part yet. So I'm going to read again. So paragraph 72, Dr. Jung says, denial of our historical foundations would be folly, and it would bring about another uprooting of consciousness. And I just think of that in terms of what I was watching today on cable news, and I go, oh my God. All right, so paragraph 73, ancient adept said, worldly people lose their roots and cling to the treetops. He means when they have their consciousness uprooted. So Dr. Jung makes the point, and this is part of the question from this morning. Dr. Jung was aiming to dismiss without mercy metaphysical claims of all esoteric teachings. So one of the comments from this morning, obviously, was that Dr. Jung was seen as a metaphysician and involved with esoterica, and yes, he was, but he was researching it for purposes of understanding how it works from a scientific and psychological point of view. And he was not promoting that it was in any way magic or wooey-woo, but he does say that words, and so now we're talking about the logos, can be used to gain power, as we know. And he wanted to do his best to prevent people from gaining power with nebulous power words. And of course, at the time, he was thinking of Adolf Hitler, who was on his doorstep in 1928, making a lot of noise, and he was using power words to bring the German populace into a psychic epidemic, which took many years, 23 years in total, to be rid in the world. And the only way it was rid of was by after all the crockery was broken and it was eliminated root and branch, then it was gone. But the psychic epidemic that he started in 1923 and went on with until 1945, so I guess it was 22 years, was an extremely serious one. It cost 60 million people their lives, and we need to understand that. And the video that I gave you a link to, the chaos violence, what's it called? Let's see. Okay, it's called Chaos, Violence, War, and Barbarism, Why Humanity and Peace Will Prevail. And so the professor who did that video, it's based on a book that he wrote, and it's very good. And basically it says why epidemics, including psychic epidemics, ultimately fail. And one of the key things that he talked about, or one of the concepts he talked about, is what Gandhi said, that in the history of the world there have been powerful people who have done many dastardly things, but in the end they all fail. Think of it, always. And that was always a pretty powerful quote to me as well. I've been conscious of it for at least 40 years that I know of. So let's see. Right, so quantum mechanics has the possibility of filling the gaps between physics and metaphysics, and I think that the alchemists were looking at that gap also, and their conclusion, and Dr. Jung's conclusion, was that the alchemical vast is us. It's you and me, and we can bring these things together even if we can't necessarily by experiment. And Andy Oxide says there will be no completely actualized correct answer to any of it. Belief and intent work retroactively through time, so some things are always right while being completely wrong. Yeah, I guess. And Grenade says it's just a framework to help further our understanding for useful applications. Same as a language, mathematics is a language too. Absolutely, I agree. So, so one of the points that Dr. Jung makes is that you cannot grasp anything metaphysical, and that's why he removes their metaphysical wrappings. And in the process, he discovers facts and processes previously veiled in symbols that were beyond Dr. Jung's comprehension, and certainly probably yours and my comprehension. I mean, most of us do not understand what the symbol of the cross or a Tibetan Buddhist mandala means at depth because it has so many layers to it. We might be able to get, 5, 10 layers, but we don't necessarily get it all. And he points out that if he does that psychologically, in other words, removing the metaphysical wrappings, then if there is anything metaphysical, it has the best opportunity to show itself. So his point is that, there may be a metaphysical God out there. He's not speaking to that, but what he's doing is giving the best opportunity for that God to show himself. So, for what it's worth. Right, Andy, I understand why your brain hurts. Mine too. He says, quantum computing will evolve itself once it reaches a peak threshold of complexity, like water eventually comes to an ordered boil. I'm told that if we get, 16 or 32, I think it's atoms. I don't know what they're working with really, but it's it's like Schrodinger's cat, that if you put a cat in a box with nuclear fission and then close the box, this is a mind game. It's not something that you should go in the laboratory and try, but if you put the cat in the box, then you don't know whether the cat in the box is still alive or not. And you can only know if you open the box and then you see whether the cat is still alive or not. And the way, as I understand it, quantum mechanics works is that there are linked particles which are either plus or minus, let's say, and if this one's plus, that one's always minus, but you don't know which is which unless you open the box, type thing. But if you have something like 30 of those, then you can create a supercomputer. Why, I don't know. I'm not that kind of scientist, but anyway. It says the singularity, it's outside of time, so it already happened or it will happen. These words don't really do it justice. Retrocausality cannot be proven. Thomas says there can be no doubt that this necessity of giving due consideration to the unconscious runs violently counter to the Occidental and particularly to the Protestant cult of consciousness. Well, I think I approve of the Protestant cult of consciousness to the point it requires actual consciousness of things, because then we may be able to solve some of our problems. So anyway, you're on paragraph 64. So anyway, let me go back to paragraph 64. Dr. Jung was saying he is irreverent to metaphysics of the East. He thinks these men were symbolical psychologists to whom no greater wrong could be done than to take them literally. Metaphysical comes into the range of experience. So his point here is that these Chinese mystics, let's call them mystics or adepts, who were working 3,000 years ago, they were describing psychic processes, psychological processes, but they were doing it in a narrative way, the same way the writers of the Bible were writing stories that symbolically represented things in their psychological experience. And I point to Answer to Job and to the two videos that are on this channel on the front page, Dr. Edinger's two videos, which he calls his portable analytic hour. It actually took me an hour and 15 minutes to read the book. But in that book, he describes what the psychological things are going on in the book of Job, which was also discovered by William Blake. And so Dr. Edinger talks through it in the context of William Blake's engravings. And the thing that is most interesting about Blake's engravings is that they were completed in 1825. So that was a good 75 years before even Freud got going with psychology and psychoanalysis. Thomas says, I think Jung is saying in this quote that if we do not give due consideration to the unconscious, remaining in awe of the Protestant cult of consciousness, it is to our detriment. Well, certainly Dr. Jung was criticizing the way of consciousness of Christian Protestantism. And mind you, he was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, so it's not quite the same as Dutch Reformed, but pretty much, I would think. It happens that Paul van der Klee is a Dutch Reformed minister, or I think they probably call themselves just Reformed now. They don't say Dutch Reformed. But I was a member of a Reformed church for about 5 years. I actually became a deacon, and I finally gave up on it after the minister couldn't explain to me what God was and what was meant by things up in the heavens. He hadn't read Jung, so he didn't understand, or he was not able to say that religious experiences are in the unconscious and in the psyche. They're not up there. This is why I criticize NFL players who point to the sky when they make a touchdown, because they're pointing in the wrong direction. The God is the God within that got them the touchdown. And so anyway, So Jung makes the point, if God is a powerful impulse in my soul, then I must pay attention to it. I can affect it, and it can affect me in many ways. And his point is that if God is something out there that I can never directly experience, then what is it? And where are the marionette strings? The marionette strings are in here or somewhere around, because we really don't know where the psyche is kept. Nobody can say where it's kept, actually. And it drives everything we do. And so we all have a powerful impulse in our soul. We don't think our own thoughts. They just come to us. I mean, I'm always surprised when I go back over these videos later on, and I say, wow, I didn't even know I knew that. and because when I'm in one of these sessions, these things are tending to come up from myself. They're not part of my ego. I'm not thinking them out. I mean, I have notes. Yes, I have notes, but my notes are only to remind me to talk about this or that topic. So anyway, going back. So Andy says, our observations collapse the superposition of the wave function. So the entirety of the universe revolves around the observer and how we perceive it. Okay, well, if you say so, Andy, that one is beyond me. I'm sorry. I'm not a physicist, although I have much interest. My wife and I often watch the shows about the universe that are on Curiosity Channel and other channels, and I would say probably 3 to 4 times a week. And so we learn a lot about astronomy and some cosmology, but you're a little bit beyond me here. I do understand that light is either a wave or a particle, but whether it's a wave or a particle depends on how you look at it. And if you look at it and see it as a wave, then it's not a particle. But if you look at it and see it as a particle, then it's not a wave. So these are a few of my favorite things that we haven't explained yet in science. Okay, so paragraph 75, the depreciation of everything psychic is a typical Western prejudice. Dr. Jung complained that if you start talking about an autonomous psychic complex, it's immediately depreciated and it's treated as a secondary phenomenon or unreal, which is just as arrogant as God outside our range of experience, responsible for everything. It's more reasonable to accord the psyche the same validity as the physical world. Both can be empirically shown, and that was his point. And he had lots of trouble over the years with theologians and with psychologists who didn't want to admit that the psyche is real. And so, for example, the behaviorists just want to treat humans like a dog, let's say, and if they give you a certain drug, then you're going to behave in a certain way, maybe. But as we've seen, that has gotten out of hand. So now I think we killed 62,000 people in the United States last year with drug overdoses. And those came up either from painkillers or they came up from antidepressants. A Jungian would not normally give you any drugs. They're going to get to the depth of your psyche and fix you. And the reason I laugh is because there's a famous Jungian quote, which is, bring me a normal man and I will fix him for you. And the reason he said that was that if you're normal, it means you've been normalized and you've become part of the mass and you're not living your own life. Simple as that. And so what Dr. Jung would put people back in touch with their own instincts and their own experiences, and that would make them unnormal again. And obviously Adolf Hitler wanted everybody to be normal. He wanted them to be a normal jackboot marching Nazi soldier, and he got that. And unfortunately then a lot of the people that had that psychic contagion had to be killed in order to stop it. So he adds here in paragraph 75, the psyche is the world in which the ego is contained. And he asks the question, are there fish who believe they contain the sea? Probably the fish don't even think about the sea, is what I guess. So Thomas says, Jung talks a lot about death in these next few paragraphs after participation mystic discussion. Yeah, I expect I'll get to that. Grenard's slit experiment is because observing the system can only be done while interacting with it, so it isn't as much that the observer is the center of all phenomenon as much as it is a localized thing. Well, yes, I agree with that. Back to Jung, though, I do agree, though, that there are a lot of cutting-edge theories that could bridge gaps to the school of thought. I certainly think that. And Thomas says, do you think it's true that Jungian psychology is perhaps aimed at folks who are quickly moving toward the end of their lives than for those who are not quite halfway there? I certainly think that's true, Thomas. And Dr. Jung said the midpoint is age 35, that once you get to that, then the psyche starts to prepare you for death, and death becomes a goal. What I would say is that young people before age 35 are bound up in reproduction, and obviously we need reproduction, and so they do the things that are necessary to reproduce and to raise the next generation of whatever society we happen to be in, and that consumes a lot of time and energy. But as people get into the 35 to 50 age group, then they start to have time to think about other things and to understand other things. And they go back and say, oh yeah, I didn't get this back when it went by me the first time. And I let it go by because I was thinking about other things like how to get my wife to marry me, that sort of thing. And so I didn't really think about it at the time. But then when you get up to about 35 or 40, you start to have enough experience under your belt so that you can actually relate to these things. It's hard to relate to them before that, because let's keep in mind that newborn babies are wild animals, and they have to be taught how to be human in a civilized society wherever they are in the world, and then they have to be educated and so on. And so many of us, in my case, I was in graduate school until I was 32 years old. I had had jobs from the time I was 15, but I took 10 years of higher education, and I really enjoyed going to college and university. It was an interesting challenge, but it wasn't my life. And at the time, I didn't know that. I thought that, if I just achieved and got my JD or my MBA or my certificate in Mandarin Chinese or whatever it was, that my life would automatically become better. But it doesn't. It prepares you for what you're going to do in the future. And so you have to pour life into it. So I heard a discussion of this recently where it's like the logos is the pitcher, and it's making a pitcher for you out of clay, but you have to put water in the pitcher, and that's experience and eros and so on. And in fact, there's a great quote from Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci, which where Leonardo didn't think much of book learning, and he says, "He who has access to the fountain does not go to the water jar." And the longer quote that goes to that is this. Leonardo described himself as, quote, "a man without letters and a discipline of experience, with its swipe against those who would cite ancient wisdom rather than make observations on their own. Though I have no power to quote from authors as they have, I shall rely on a far more worthy thing, on experience. He who has access to the fountain does not go to the water jar." And so that's the point, that you're building up a water jar when you're going through education. You don't know it because you're being challenged to get through the next step and put the next brick or the next spin on the pot, whatever it is, however you want to do the metaphor. But ultimately you end up with the pot, and then you have to actually do something with it. Going back here, Jerome says natural phase, first half of life, prime aim was establishing oneself in the world, gaining an income and raising a family. Grenade says Jungian psychology, spelled Y-O-U-N-G, yep. And Jerome says cultural phase, second half of life, evaluation of earlier values. The goal in this period was one of conserving previous values together with the recognition of their opposites. Jerome adds, this meant that individuals had developed the undeveloped and neglected aspects of their personality. Thomas says Hinduism has the four stages of life as student, householder, retired, and lastly, renunciate. I know that I'm reading Jung in a different way now than I did at 26 or 30 or even 40. Absolutely, and so am I, Thomas, no doubt about it. Bernard says, I'm still in college, but I was certainly needed Jung's work to understand myself. I was living my life in a manner with drugs that would have led to my death, and a spiritual experience that changed my life, redirected my life toward a greater purpose than myself. And, I think that that's fair enough. I think we experienced that ourselves. If I think of just this YouTube channel, okay, I've been working on it for 2 years, and without any real income from it, and with the exception of a few supporters on Patreon. And about 4 weeks ago, YouTube announced to me that I could monetize the channel, meaning that I could earn a little bit of money from advertising on the channel. And so I've done that on some of the videos. I don't do it on videos where I'm reading a copyrighted work. but I do it on videos from the session, and that is proven to be not very lucrative, even though there are almost 2,000 members of this channel now, and lots of people reading it. Just to give you an order of magnitude, there are 24 members of our advanced reading group. There are typically 35 to 50 people that log on here. There are something like 1,760 subscribers, and in the last month we've been consistently over 105,000 minutes every 28 days. So roughly, what's that? It's 4,000 minutes a day, something like that, that people are watching this particular YouTube channel. So it's quite large, and yet the income that YouTube has now offered for that is less than $10 so far. So it's not like I can do this for the monetary return, and I do it only because I'm driven to do it, that my psyche tells me I need to do it, and I don't know where that's leading me. And this was Jung's fundamental question about Christianity, because he said, you know, the pastors keep pointing back at the Pentecost and what the Spirit was doing back 2,000 years ago, and then justifying it by all this logos, all these writings by these different theologians over these many years, a couple thousand years worth. But Jung's question is, where is the Spirit going? And what is its goal? And I don't know what it is, but I know within me, part of the Spirit that's within me has me trying to do this as a way of passing the baton with Dr. Jung's oeuvre, okay? And because it's the young people, the people that are still in college, who are going to make a difference in our culture in the next 75 years. It's not going to be me, because I'm already over 70. So I can only pass the baton down the line and get others to work on it. And that doesn't mean that needs to be your role. That's my role. But if you want to help me, by all means, please do. I'll be happy to help anyone who wants to start a Jung reading group somewhere. So Thomas says, Grenade, I have to admit I smoked my share of pot, even while being enamored of Jung. Grenade says, ha ha ha, synthetic opioids and Xanax were my drugs of choice, no good. And so there's a private conversation going on here. I hope the monetization works out. Well, I think that seems unlikely, unless we get a lot more members in the advanced reading group. But and Renan says he would tip me if he wasn't broke himself. Well, you know, I know where you're coming from. That's where I've been all my life almost. And no matter how much ahead you get, you're still right back there paying the bills in the end. And so you have to find some other way of getting satisfaction. I think I've shown everybody the lovely 63-foot yacht, the title of which was Never Enough. And the point is, in the material world, which is what you're generally working with in the first half of life when you're trying to raise a family, and you have to have a house, and you have to have the station wagon, and all these other material things, and you think material things will make you happy, and then you get a 63-foot yacht, and it's not enough. And I had the same experience when I bought a smaller yacht, And the first time we took it out, my partner and I took it out, we said simultaneously, we need a bigger boat. And that was true on the Chesapeake Bay. But it doesn't matter how big it is. I live next to a marina that's a deep water marina, so we have very large yachts coming into our marina, and they're all tied up. Nobody's using them. And so I consider them as monuments to the materialist point of view, and it doesn't bring you happiness. So anyway, paragraph 76, Dr. Jung is talking about the diamond body, the golden flower, and the field of the square inch. Well, I'm going to tell you a little secret about the square inch. But the point of the golden flower, first, let me remind you of this picture, if I can do that. Okay, so here's the golden flower for this oak tree. So every creature, as I've said a few times, every creature in our process of individuation, we all know how unconsciously to become what we are, whether we're a human or an oak tree or a mouse or whatever it is we are in nature. We all unconsciously know how to do that. But every oak tree is different, and every human being is different too. And so what Dr. Jung was about was teaching people how to pay attention to what you were meant to be. And that comes from the self. It comes from the God image. That's what individuation is about, is, as the U.S. Army said, be all you can be. And that's what we're talking about here in individuation. So the diamond body, from the point of view of the golden flower, is the flowering into that thing. And here's the image of it, which is the golden flower is you fully blossomed into what you were intended to be, just as this oak tree is fully blossomed into a fully grown oak tree, which is different from all other oak trees. And so the amusing thing, which I don't think Dr. Jung knew at that time, but I've done a lot of traveling and a lot of things with China, because I was trained in Mandarin Chinese at the Defense Language Institute. And so I happen to have interest in things Chinese. I majored in Asian history in my college years. And I picked up a book about life in the Forbidden City. And one of the chapters of that was about the harem in the emperor's household. And when they're talking about the field of the square inch, they're talking about the entrance to the vagina as the field basically where the field of dreams begins, I guess is the way to think about it. I don't think Dr. Jung knew that when they were referring to the square inch that they were referring to that, but in my experience, that's what they were referring to. And so they're referring to the golden flower as being the female genitalia in one way, and also the source of the golden flower coming forward in terms of human psychological development. Thomas says, we're glad you're following your bliss this way, Skip. Well, thank you. So far, it's working out. I noticed I'm getting up toward 700 videos on this YouTube channel, so there's a lot to look at. Okay, so there's a footnote in this paragraph 76, and Dr. Jung said, it is characteristic of Western man that he has split apart the physical and the spiritual for epistemological purposes. And so just a definition of epistemological, because that's a favorite stump the stars word from Dr. Jung. The dictionary definition of epistemological is a branch of philosophy that investigates the origin, nature, methods, and limits of human knowledge. And so, once again, I'll read this quote. It is characteristic of Western man that he has split apart the physical and the spiritual for epistemological purposes, in other words, so that they could be studied. And then he goes on to say, but these opposites exist together in the psyche, and psychology must recognize that fact. Psychic means, what he says here is, psychic means physical and spiritual. The ideas in our text all deal with this intermediate world, which seems unclear and confused because the concept of psychic reality is not yet current among us. And he goes on to say something objective in which the ego is included, namely the self. And so, in terms of his description of the fish who thinks that he contains the sea, that would be the ego thinking it can contain the self. And the self is the sea, the universe that each of us walks around with. Okay, let's see. Okay, we got some more time. So going on, in paragraph 77, he says that the change is a feeling similar to a father to whom a son is born. And St. Paul said, yet not I, but Christ liveth within me, the symbol of Christ as the Son of Man. Subtle feelings infinitely important for the individual's well-being. And so, I know that when my father was dying, I said to him that we all stand on his shoulders, and that was a very meaningful moment between my father and me. He said he knew that, and 3 hours later he was dead. So the guidance of life passes over to an invisible center. This is the self, as Dr. Jung later explained it in many of his works, but he hadn't gotten up to that point in 1928 when he was writing this essay. So he says, religious language is full of imagery depicting this feeling of free dependence or calm acceptance. So it's the calm acceptance of the religious perspective, I guess. And I know I had an epiphany when I was watching the video on YouTube of Dr. Jung where he said, I have no need to believe, I know. And in that moment, I also know. And it's an experience that if you haven't had it, then you won't appreciate what I'm talking about. But once you've had it, then you calmly accept your situation in life. And so the examples that I've put of breakthroughs to the unconscious, there's a playlist on the channel called Breakthroughs to the Unconscious. Those are my description of some religious experiences as they have affected me. Now, they are not going to affect, if you go back and look at those videos, they won't affect you in the same way, but you will see how affected I am. And so that's an example of what I'm talking about, but you have to go out and get your own. Sorry. So paragraph 78. There's a consequence to the detachment of consciousness. Its subjective I live becomes objective, it lives me. And so when the ego is running around saying I live, then you realize it lives you. You realize that there's nothing that you say that you can control, really. It really comes from someplace else. So, I challenge you. It's 23 minutes to 10. At 10 o'clock, what are you going to say to your wife? Now, whatever it is, I predict that you don't know what it is right now. And you can't control it even if you want to. So even if you want to, and if you want to plan it, I am going to say this to my wife, and you write it down and you say you're going to do it at 10 o'clock, something will go wrong and that won't be what you say. Or if you do, then you know that you're having to physically control it, and you know what I'm talking about then, at least. So anyway, once you achieve this state, which is a religious attitude, let's say, regardless of religion, it doesn't matter what religion, you're felt to be in a higher state than the previous state, and you're free from compulsion and impossible responsibility, which are the inevitable in participation mystique. In other words, in participation mystique, which is the world of the primitive, you're just going with the herd, and you have all these responsibilities that you have to fulfill. Once you realize that, aha, I'm free of that compulsion, I can decide for myself what to do and how to do it. And then you have to decide, and then it becomes a moral issue. So, for example, all of a sudden you have a situation which arises which suggests that you could have a love affair. Well, Dr. Jung would say you have permission to have a love affair. So, and God is not going to strike you dead, because God has two streams coming out. One is instinctual and one is for culture. And so it's up to you to decide what is the right answer. And then it's up to you to decide how it's handled later on also. And that can be quite complicated. It can really screw up your life. I made the decision to go on to a new wife, and this was 32 years ago, after 17 years of marriage to another woman. And I had my reasons why that turned out to be the right moral decision. And I'm satisfied with the result, because today, with my daughters all in the 40-year-old range, I have as good relationship with all of them and with my grandchildren as I would think possible, even if I had stayed in the original marriage. And so, but that's a function of how I handled the situation after I changed partners. And that was quite complicated. It's beyond the scope of this video. But in any case, if you're free of the compulsion of, and here's the thing, my first wife was beating me up over promises, compulsion, okay? And she says, you promised me you would do so-and-so at our wedding. Well, there was a problem, which was she wasn't keeping up with her side of the bargain either. And so she was trying to beat me up with compulsion and with the impossible responsibility of supporting the family in an environment that didn't suit me. And that just couldn't be. And once I went for freedom and made my decision morally, I still 32 years later think I made the right decision, but there are costs. There are huge costs to that. Among those costs was I lost the experience of seeing my daughters growing up, except for on special weekends. I would go see their performances and that sort of thing. But and we were living 375 miles apart, and I made over 200 trips to see them over a period of about 13, 14 years. And so I did keep a strong relationship with the girls, but I didn't see them on a day-to-day basis, and I didn't influence them as their father on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that I lost. It was a big cost. And the other was it took 10 years to get my life back together financially, and that was a big cost also. So anyway, Dr. Jung's talking about this liberation, quote unquote, fills Paul completely. The consciousness of being a child of God delivers one from the bondage of blood, reconciliation with all that happens. As you see from my discourse over the last few minutes, I am at peace with my decisions and reconciled with those. The gaze of one who has attained fulfillment turns back to the beauty of nature. And so, I do see this. We have one member of the advanced reading group who does spend a lot of time with nature, and she seems entirely fulfilled by that. Okay, let's see how much more. Ooh, gotta hustle here. All right. So in paragraph 79, the Pauline Christ symbol, the supreme religious experiences of West and East confront one another. Christ, the sorrow-laden hero, versus the golden flower that blooms in the purple hall of the city of jade. That difference is an abyss of history, but what he's talking about here is the distinction between the ego on one side and the self on the other, because later on it comes out in his work that he and Dr. Edinger saw Christ as on the ego end of this instinct to spirituality continuum, or let's see, it's the ego and self spectrum versus instinct and spirituality, or spirituality and instinct. So I guess it's a cross, okay? And so he says that this distinction is a problem fit for the crowning work of a future psychologist. Well, it turns out that Jung himself became that psychologist prophetically, because as Dr. Jung points out, that on the Christian side is the ego, the sorrow-laden side of the equation, and on the East side, whether it's in Taoism or Buddhism or Hinduism, they're on the self side of that divide. Let's see. So Grenade says, any tips on how to be comfortable in not knowing? And he says, I'm guilty of being a control freak. Well, I mean, the traditional answer, Grenade, is to focus on the tenets of religion and just believe until you get to the point where you know. And so in Buddhism, they talk about the self-sprung ones. Okay, that's the people that have been spontaneously enlightened. And in one of those essays that I gave you a link to in this chat, Dr. Edinger answers a question. There's a question and answer, set of questions and answers at the end of it. I forget which one. It's either the individuation one or the encounters one. And he's asked, well, how do you have this moment? And his answer is, you concentrate on whatever you love or hate. Reflect on whatever you love or hate, because that's putting you into the opposites. That's the field of opposites. And as Dr. Harding says, that's the second stage in Buddhism, the man of ordinary intelligence. And ultimately, the objective is to rise above the opposites and be able to observe them. It's like climbing a mountain and being able to look down in the valley, and you see the storm going on down in the valley, but you don't have to directly participate. And so I guess the answer is, you could go into the college chapel and without doing anything directly religious, just reflect on what you love and hate in your life, whatever it is. And pretty soon you're going to start to see the opposites, and you will see them everywhere. And that's becomes the process of individuation. And that will lead you to something, okay? And whatever it leads you to, just follow that path and until you're defeated. And when you're defeated, you try to do something, whatever it is. I mean, you could decide, I'm going to be a Marine officer. Okay, well, I was a Marine officer candidate, and I was a staff platoon commander at OCS, both on two different occasions, 3 years apart. And what I can tell you is that 30% of all the people who say they want to be Marine Corps officers leave on their own request from OCS. They thought they wanted to be Marine officers. They went through all the paperwork. They got themselves in some sort of physical condition thinking they could do it, and they got to OCS and they requested departure because they didn't want to do it anymore. And so that's a kind of defeat. But then if that's a defeat for you, then you have to lament the defeat, and then you reflect on that defeat, and then you're reborn into something else. So you go back in the chapel or go to some quiet place and reflect on what you love or hate, and your psyche, yourself, will tell you what to try next. And that's how your golden flower ultimately opens, and you find your way through until you ultimately find where you should be. So Grenade says, I meet a lot of women in bars superficially, but I am afraid that starting a relationship will distract me from my current goals. It's like my heart and mind are conflicted, not sure which one to follow. Well, I guess the question is it really your heart and mind, or is it your genitals and mind that is conflicted? You might want to reflect on that one, given that you're still in college. If you reflect on that question, I don't mean to be facetious here. If it's your genitals that's doing the talking, then you have to consider that as the direction to try. But then there are the moral questions that circle around that issue. And if you follow that path, then you can end up in 20 or 25 years of child rearing. And so you need to be prepared for that. These are complicated questions at your age. Thomas repeats the quote here. It's a question for a future psychologist. I see. I think you were responding to Grenade, so I'll leave it at that. I recently read a quote by a writer who said you can only write well about something you intensely love or intensely dislike. And in my writing experience, that seems to be true. I think that's largely true, and I don't want to get into the complexities of my thinking on this, but I think if you want to be a writer, if that's your perspective, and you start writing and you focus on what you love or hate, that will get you a long way, and along that way you will get further guidance. So okay, so the Western idea in paragraph 80, the Western idea is we emphasize the incarnation of Christ, and then we rely on divine grace. And in the East, they say without beginning, without end, without past, and without future. And so that's a reliance on your own inner work. That's the difference of approach. But here's the reality. There's no puppet master up there. And God is not up there. So God didn't make that football player make that touchdown. There's no way, because we can see back to the Big Bang and no God so far. But God is within, and it's that God, the God image, or the metaphysical God. We can't say which, because we can't tell the difference as human beings. But whatever it is, that's the God that made that football player go to the gym all those days and get himself in the physical condition that made him possible to be on that team and to cross that goal line. That's God. Okay, the Tao grows out of the individual. The imitatio Christi has this disadvantage. In the long run, we worship as a divine example a man who embodied the deepest meaning of life, and then, out of sheer imitation, we forget to make real our own deepest meaning, our own self-realization. So that's a pretty profound statement that from a Taoist point of view, from the Golden Flower point of view, you grow out of yourself, and by that I mean the capital letter self, the God image, from a Taoist point of view. But in Christianity, at least, we're told to imitate Christ. And I'll just read this quote once more so that you can grok it. The imitatio Christi has this disadvantage. In the long run, we worship as a divine example a man who embodied the deepest meaning of life, and then, out of sheer imitation, we forget to make real our own deepest meaning, which is self-realization. And so that's an interesting point for people who are following Christianity as a belief, as instead of as knowing. Okay, nobody's saying that there's anything wrong with Christianity. Not me, not Dr. Jung. As Dr. Jung said, all religions were earlier methods of mental hygiene, and they were all addressing things that our psyche needs. And so if you have a practice of going to any religious service of any denomination, you will very likely feel better because you go through rituals and so on that are familiar to you probably since childhood, and that helps you from a mental hygiene point of view. So nobody's saying anything is wrong with that, and in fact, if pastors understood that that's what it is, then they could help their parishioners understand it too, instead of having at least most of the men coming in saying, oh, I'm not sure about this, what about the logos and what about the scientific method? And, but the logos only gets you so far. It gets you the water jar, but not the water. And so you have to remember that. The women tend to understand about the water, but they don't know how to put it in a jar, or they don't know where to get a jar. And so paragraph 81, not everyone has the task of being a great leader of humanity or a great rebel. It might be possible to reach realization in their own way. And so I said, i.e. individuation. So the point being that individuation doesn't have to mean that you're going to be president of the United States or chairman of the PTA or whatever it is, but you find your own realization, and you find that through this cycle of the Job archetype, which is contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth, and you follow that cycle multiple times, and it leads you along the path of life until you become what you ultimately are. And so, here, although Dr. Jung didn't mention individuation, here's a prefiguration of his later ideas about individuation. And he says, great innovations always begin in the most unlikely places. The reality of the earth will not forever remain veiled like the virgins of Tertullian. So here is an interesting sort of sideswipe that Dr. Jung is making, which is about the health of the earth itself, and maybe today we would say it would be global warming, but obviously he was aware that Western society has been denuding the earth really viciously, especially in the last century, and up until now almost it's remained veiled that we were denuding the earth, but now it can't be denied. And so we know that we're strip mining and all those sorts of things. And then the question will become, where will the innovation come from that will stop that from happening? And that's still unknown, and the innovation that might stop it is going to come from an unlikely place. We don't know where. So if man admits to himself he is as he is, if in a meaningless way, he's just a fool. But if he knows the significance of what he is doing, he could belong to a higher order of man who makes real the Christ symbol, regardless of the suffering involved. So this goes back to the parable of the unjust steward in the Bible, where Christ came upon a man who was working on the Sabbath, and he said, why are you working? And the man said, well, I have work to do. And so Christ says, well, man, if you know what you are doing, you are blessed. But if you don't know what you're doing, then you're violating the law and you're a criminal. And so this is what Dr. Jung is talking about here, is that you know the significance of what you're doing and you don't really care whether it violates the law or not. Okay, so the outward law becomes an inner conviction over time. We might become the higher man within ourselves. And so paragraph 82, all of this is a step in the evolution of a higher consciousness on its way to unknown goals, and is not metaphysics as ordinarily understood. If only psychology, it is experienceable, understandable, and thank God, real, a living reality full of possibilities. When we say God or the Tao, we can only talk of the knowable, not the unknowable. God versus the God image argument. Okay, so this is why he always said that he wasn't talking about the metaphysical God, which is unknowable. He meant the God image. I think all psychology is actually metaphysical, but at least up till now, I don't think we've really nailed it down from a physical point of view yet. But I do acknowledge that Dr. Jung did identify the self, the God image, in the human psyche as the deepest archetype in the psyche. And so all of these things that he was talking about were at least experienceable and therefore part of the human experience. Okay, let's quickly look. Thomas's nice quote about the imitation of Christ there also. Mere imitation won't get us to self-realization. Gernot, I wonder if humanity as a whole is unconsciously creating a God in the most real sense of the word. Just look at how the internet has changed the world. I actually believe this but can't know. Artificial intelligence might be the one way, who knows. Well, I'm not convinced that artificial intelligence is the way. I mean, you have to read Asimov's rules of the robot, but or the rules of robotics. But in any case, I think that's the point, is that we affect God and God affects us. And Dr. Jung would say that God is the unconscious. I mean, if you look at the front page of the YouTube channel, you'll find Dr. Jung's letter to the Reverend Cox. And on the front of that, there are 4 or 5 equivalencies. One of them is God equals the unconscious. And so he also equals the collective unconscious. And this is why we have to think about these things, because this is why I believe, and this I developed independently before I was far enough into Jung to really understand this. I kept going around the world, and I've been around the world at least 75 times in my life, okay, in terms of actually literally flying around the globe. And so I've talked to a lot of people in a lot of countries, and I used to regularly ask them the question, what one factor above all others makes the United States unique, makes it the strongest in the world, the strongest financial system, the strongest military, and so on. And it's a stump the stars question. I mean, ask it to yourself. What one factor above all else makes the United States unique? And I finally came to the conclusion myself, after a lot of reflection on it, that it is the diversity of the country, because we have every ethnic, racial, religious group in the world here, every country of national origin. We're all Americans. And it looks pretty bad when you look at cable television, but if you just go out into your community, you'll find out that things are pretty good and things work pretty well in the United States. And so we do have a lot of clashes, but the point is that consciousness comes from pain and these kinds of clashes. And in countries where those clashes are put down and prevented, they get left behind. And if you look around the world, the countries that are ruled by dictators haven't done well. I mean, when you look at, in my lifetime, the USSR was considered the equal of the United States, and we had this Cold War that went on for all of my years in service, and some battles of the Cold War were hot, like Vietnam, but now, notwithstanding whatever you might have seen on cable news earlier this evening, Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. It's 1/20th of the economy of the United States. And so the point is that the clash of ideas works like tempering steel. And every time there's a good idea that comes into the system from any group, we adopt them. And anytime a bad idea comes up, boy, it gets pounded out of the system pretty quickly. And so the result of that is that over 400 years of that process, we now have a very strong country and a very viable country, even when we have as much conflict as we have going on right now, which is a lot. And so, yeah, I mean, melting pot is sort of a generic idea, but I'm talking about the actual clashes, the debates, and so on, the arguments that we see on TV. They're actually working the impurities out of the system one way or another, whatever the impurities are. Okay, so paragraph 83. I'm now in the conclusion. I'm going to wrap this up in 5 minutes. Paragraph 83. The purpose of what Dr. Jung was doing was to bridge understanding between East and West. And so he has this quote: technical directions are valuable for those who know, for example, what a camera is or a combustion engine, but they are useless to anyone who has no idea of such apparatus. Western man, for whom I write, is in an analogous position. In other words, we in the West do not understand how our own psychology works, okay? We're the camera, but we don't know how it works. And at least this is what he was saying 90 years ago, and essentially I don't think we've improved yet. In other words, we don't know how our own apparatus works. The tremendous experiment of becoming conscious unites the most diverse cultures in a common task. So every culture in the world has this task. We have to all figure out where the Spirit is taking us. And the Spirit has lots of chances. It has 7.5 billion chances. And so the rest of us, so each one of us has to see where the Spirit is taking us. And, obviously, I have my own ideas about how the process works, which I've just described, but it's a process that happens everywhere. So now, after the commercial internet has become so popular since the year 2000, every culture pot, I actually wrote an essay called Culture Pot Full of Holes. Every culture pot has holes in it now. And so all these myths that have been existing around the world forever are suddenly being debunked. And it's the new generation, the millennials, who are now having to deal with this amorphous mass of ideas from all over the world. And it's especially intense in countries that haven't been exposed to the West up till now. There was an old marching song in World War I, which is, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? And so that's a serious question. And what we do see is that the United States is like a magnet, and we have more, let's say this, we have more gravity than any other country. And so there are people trying to come to the United States and become Americans from every country in the world, every country. And I don't think we have a net outflow to any country. And so that's something to think about. It's a specific gravity of the country. And that's true even with our current troubles. And so it's why I'm still proud to be an American and proud of my service to the country, even though I'm not very proud of some things that I see on cable news sometimes. Okay, so paragraph 84 now, this is in the conclusion. The widening of our consciousness ought not to proceed at the expense of other kinds of consciousness. It should come about through the development of those elements of our psyche which are analogous to those of the alien psyche, just as the East cannot do without our technology, science, and industry. So basically, Dr. Jung is saying we have something to learn from the East and from Eastern approaches to religion. And there's an interesting observation he makes here. No European mandalas known to me achieve the conventionally and traditionally established harmony and perfection of the Eastern mandala. So, or mandala. I keep arguing with myself about correct pronunciation, but the point is Westerners who attempt to do mandalas, unless they do it with machine assistance, do not do it with the same harmony and perfection as the East. If you've ever seen the Tibetan Buddhist monks make a mandala with sand, a sand mandala, they take 5 days, and 4 or 5 monks will pour colored sand on a piece of wood over a 5-day period, and it's invariably essentially perfect. And okay, they memorize what they're going to do, but nonetheless, they produce it every time. And so the point of my saying this is, what does this closing comment say about our mental hygiene circa 1928? Okay, so he was speaking as of 1928. The question is, can you go in your kitchen and draw a perfect mandala without using a pattern that you find on the internet? That's the question. And Thomas says the West mandalas are MRIs, perhaps. Yeah, except those are machine assisted. So anyway, all right. Well, I think I overstayed, so I'll probably lose the beginning part of this video, but thank you for being here, and it does appear that I'm still in sync as of now on my screen, and I hope that we have a in sync video when I hang up and then allow it. It'll have to be crunched by YouTube, but ultimately it'll be public and online within an hour or two. Yeah, Grenade says, well, you know how his story goes, civilization, rise and fall. And yeah, that's an issue because her story would be to create wholeness and have the civilization continue on and develop. And so that's the distinction between perfection and wholeness, which is a distinction between the logos and the eros. And the point is that we need both. And what I would urge all of you who may be great followers of Jordan Peterson, I like him very much and the things that I've learned from him, but at the end of the day, you have to take the rules that he lays down, like the 12 rules of life, and you have to put a life into those rules. You have to get a life. That's the key. So, namaste. Thank you, Thomas. And okay. So, don't worry about the derailments, Grenade. I have the option of removing them before I make shorter versions of these videos. So, that's the nature of a reading group, is that everybody gets to talk. I had hoped that we could do it by video conference, but it seems that video conference is not the popular way to do it, because a couple of us were over on Zoom earlier this evening, and it was only 2 of us that were there. Nobody showed up, even though I'd been announcing that we would try to do it on Zoom. So I presume that that is a reflection of the fact that people don't want to appear on video and so on. Thomas says, I'm reading Karen Armstrong's 12 Steps Toward a Compassionate Life. Quite good, meeting fear with compassion. I'm sure it's good. The caveat in that is that you need rules too. And so we can be compassionate, but we need both the pot and the water. And Granad says 12 steps, it's always 12. Well, 12 is an important number in numerology for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that 1 becomes 2, and 2 because you need a partner, and then whatever you create between you, whether you're a heterosexual couple or a homosexual couple, you create something between you, which is 3, and that's 1 plus 2 added together, which is what 12 is. And so there's lots of very long riffs in numerology about what 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, and 12 mean, among many others. And so my wife and I, when we got a license plate recently, I'm not sure if I remember what the license plate number is, but it's a 5-digit number, and the first two numbers add to 7. The middle number is 7, and the second the last two numbers add to 7. And when you add them all up, the number is 21. And so when the car dealer wanted us to take a different license plate number, we said, no, we have to have that number. And so we had to wait 3 weeks to get it, but it was worth getting it. That's how weird you can get sometimes with some of this stuff. Okay, so if you want to join a video conference, Grenade, then at 1:30 tomorrow and every Tuesday, we have the advanced reading group, and you'll need to provide some support through Patreon, and the group has pretty much agreed to $10 a month for that. We're currently working on Ion, but there are video recordings of the earlier part of the book. We're about halfway through chapter 4, and that's the chapter on the self. So tomorrow we will be doing the second half of chapter 4 on the self, and then next week we're going to begin with Christ as a symbol of the self, which is a huge chapter and will probably take many weeks to work our way through. So you're welcome to join if you'd like, and I've provided my email address in this chat, so send me an email with your regular email address and I can add you to the advanced reading group Dropbox. There's 2 Dropboxes. There's a general Dropbox that anyone listening to this, I will add you if you send me an email to skip.conover@gmail.com. There's an advanced reading group Dropbox, which is only for the participants in the video conferences, which are on Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. I look forward to seeing you then. And currently we have 24 members of that group. We don't have that many appearing every week, but they all have access to this Dropbox so that they can watch it at times that are convenient to them. So anyway, I've got to stop this or I'm going to lose half the video. So I'm going to stop now, and I'll see you next week on Monday at 8 p.m. And I guess we're back on YouTube now. So sorry for the confusions.